like to introduce Don? Because Don is.
Oh.
Yeah, he was kind enough to arrange for Don Fischer to come here. I guess he's been doing work for the UC system to give us a presentation on export controls.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Don Fischer of Fischer&Associates. Don is an expert in export controls and works with private companies and universities and other institutions around the country. His work involves a variety of different research settings. So he's used to working with universities like the University of California that spends a lot of its time working within the fundamental research exclusion, as well as other universities that engage in a lot of licensed research activity. So Don, I'll turn over to you to mention any more about your background. Otherwise, we can launch right into it.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Before we continue, I also want to introduce UC's new export control administrator, and that's Brian Warshawski, who just joined us 2 weeks ago, right?
I think I'm in my second week.
Second week. So we're delighted to have Brian, and I think UCOP's retention of Brian is really consistent with the level of attention that not only the UC system is now paying to export control, but really all significant research institutions around the country. So I'm going to take us through rather quickly the fundamentals of what I think that we need to know in an engineering context. And we are a small enough group. So I would encourage you, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'll try to answer it. Or if I think actually the answer will fall in the latter part of the presentation, bear with me. I'll put it in a parking lot, and I promise I will come back to it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about why awareness is so critical today to Berkeley, and what are controls and how they're enforced, and how they impact us specifically as PIs and research administrators. How do we remain compliant and subject really to as few rules as possible, that balance between pursuing our research objectives and remaining in compliance. And then we'll talk a little bit about a separate regime called OFAC and what that means and where we turn for help. So I want to just provide a moment of context. The export control regulations really are those federal regulations across numerous agencies. So the Department of Commerce, the Department of State, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, Treasury, Energy. Everybody's got their hand in the soup. And these are the regulations that govern what hardware, software, materials, and technology can leave the country by way of export, as well as what materials, hardware, software, applications, etc., in some cases are controlled in our laboratories for purposes of access by certain foreign nationals. So the bottom line with these agencies is that the term export is defined very broadly. We can send something out of the country by any means, electronically, through conversation, by hand carrying something, by faxing it, shipping it as cargo, sending it by FedEx. And likewise, depending on how an item or technical data is controlled in our laboratory, that will affect how these agencies define access for our purpose. So that's the background. Why are we concerned? Well, historically, the export control rules grew up really around, post-Cold War, and then they were applied mostly to corporations, dealing in proprietary and sensitive commercial applications. And so even 10, 15 years ago, we would have seen export control audits in Silicon Valley, at Intel, at National Semiconductor, IBM, Hewlett, all these companies. And they had to be very concerned about their foreign national access to these things. Then we fast forward to 9/11. And after 9/11, we start to see a greater FBI presence in connection with the security theme that the country was encountering on our campuses. And the light bulb goes off in Washington that, you know, we have most of our major research universities here have significant presence, foreign national presence, and we have growing portfolios of international collaborations. So putting all of that together, we start to see about 5 years ago increased enforcement on the part of the agencies at research institutions. And that has crescendoed over these years to now where we actually have, across the country, investigations, some settled cases, a couple of criminal prosecutions, etc. The way that these regulations are written is that the liability on the civil side for an export violation can be attributed not only to the institution, but to the individual person to whom an export violation can be attributed. And on the civil side, largely, of course, we're talking about, you know, actions, inadvertent actions, negligent actions, etc. And then were there to be a finding or a concern that the activity was intentional, an intentional violation, the matter can be referred to the Department of Justice for investigation and prosecution, and we have seen some of those. So, you know, UC's effort to enhance its program from an oversight standpoint and across its campuses is really a reflection of this increased enforcement environment and a well-intentioned effort to alert you as faculty members and administrators of the liability associated with it. Yes?
I have a general question which popped up several times during the last several years. It's not only research that you mentioned, it's also teaching. So the issue is, UC system has a policy of not discriminating among its students. However, software that we usually use in our teaching, like teaching tools, classrooms, and so on, our students has to go through licensing process, and foreign students do not get the license. So what is your answer to that?
So what I'd like to do is, because we're going to address that, and if I may, I'd like to talk about that in the context in which we're going to approach it. Because I think that, if that's okay, because I think it will make more sense. But I will address it. Because you see, we do have this anti-discrimination policy, and at the same time, we have a problem about what to do with controlled research tools. And really, it's a matter of reconciling those two sides. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second, we'll get there. Thank you. So again, exports, outbound shipments by any means, laboratory access, and the way that the federal agencies carve this up is that they create what's known as a dual-use bucket under the Commerce Department, items that are civilian by design and application, but could have a military capability, or by the Department of State, we call that ITAR, items that are designed, modified, or adapted for a defense purpose. But defense is interpreted very broadly because it could be a military electronic. We're not just talking about an armament or a weapon. We're really talking about any tool or application that could enable a defense application. And when an item is controlled, the premise is that one would require an export license or prior authorization from that particular agency who is governing the item in order to export it. Again, if we're sending it out of the country, or as we'll see in certain cases in terms of laboratory access. Now, here at UC, we are an exporter of things. We are an exporter of data. And at the same time, in our laboratories, we actually, have a great deal of sophisticated instruments and technology. One thing, we operate throughout the UC system under the fundamental research exclusion. And that means that all of our research work is performed with the intention of publishing it, and in the process of doing that, we accept no publication restrictions from a sponsor, be that a federal agency or an industrial sponsor, or whether we are the prime or whether we're the sub, nor do we accept any citizenship restrictions as to who can participate on the project. Why? If we do accept one of those kinds of restrictions, and it only takes one, then by definition we are no longer performing fundamental research. So that is key. So sponsored research set at UC policy, UCOP, as implemented across the system, always attempts to negotiate out restricted provisions that might be included by a sponsor in a contract or award. And when it is not possible to negotiate out a restricted provision, the policy is to walk away from the work so that we can preserve this fundamental research exclusion. The benefit to us is that if we are doing fundamental research, then from a laboratory access standpoint, it means that we can essentially maintain an open laboratory with foreign national access to equipment and technology that were we a private company performing proprietary commercial work, we might have to get a license to allow that foreign national access. So this is the key premise. So an example, if I am National Semiconductor and I have a semiconductor etching machine, the etching chamber that performs the dielectric etching and the technology to run it is controlled by the Commerce Department. It's dual use because a refinement of the chamber technology could result in defense-level chip etching. Now, National Semiconductor doesn't send it to China. Instead, they want to have a Chinese foreign national work on that etching chamber. National Semiconductor will have to get an export license before they allow that Chinese national to have access to that etching chamber. It's called a deemed export. The presumption is at the point of access, the export has occurred, person has an, and that person is not a U.S. person, which means they're here on a temporary immigrant status. They are neither a permanent resident, a U.S. citizen, nor are they the recipient of political asylum status. Now, if we were in that position, it would be awful, because we would then be in the position of having to license our foreign nationals to access that same technology. In our context, if we are doing fundamental research and we intend to publish, we may not ultimately publish everything, but we intend to publish the body of research, the results, we can allow access to that equipment and to that technology, assuming that we're using it for our research. That is very, very important, and that is why we decline restrictions, so that we can allow that degree of access. Here's where the distinction between the Commerce Department rule and the State Department rule kicks in. Because Commerce, the dual-use universe, says, yes, you may apply the FRE, and you've not accepted any restrictions, but for a few a few exclusions, advanced cryptography, a few other things, your foreign nationals can safely have access to this. When we get to ITAR, the State Department says, notwithstanding the fact that you are using an ITAR classified instrument or technology, in the course of your fundamental research. Even if you are going to publish the results, the tool or the technology you may have to restrict access to. Now, certainly, if we accepted restrictions, we'd have to restrict the results as well, but we're not doing that. But the question then becomes, what ITAR tools or technology do we have in our laboratories that we would have to restrict? So an important distinction between ITAR and the dual-use universe is that, you know, not every dual-use item is controlled for every country and every foreign national. I could send that semiconductor etching chamber to France. I might not need a license, but I send it to China, I would need a license. Same token, I want to have a French foreign national, I wouldn't need a license because it's not controlled for France. National Semiconductor wants to have a Chinese foreign national on it, they would need a license. ITAR says, because this is a defense-level article or technology, all foreign nationals are presumed licensable. And not only that, there are about 15 countries whose foreign nationals you would never get a license. They are per se prohibited because this is defense tools, defense technology. Why is that problematic? China is among them. The State Department has a policy of not granting access to ITAR technology to Chinese foreign nationals on the premise that we don't want to enhance the Chinese military capability. Now, what does that mean for purposes of ITAR access? Pat says to me, Don, I want you to go into the laboratory. There's a black box sitting on the table. The black box happens to be ITAR classified, either because it was designed for military purposes or it includes a military electronic of some kind, an oscillator, for example. I'm a foreign national. Can I look at that black box? Applying a reasonableness standard, I would argue there is no problem merely observing that black box. Not that we wouldn't find people in state who would disagree, but at the end of the day, just looking at something doesn't disclose what's controlled about it. Pat says to me, Don, I want you to push the button and turn the dial. So I'm using it. Have I learned anything about what makes it controlled, about the technology? Probably not. That is probably okay. Pat says to me, Don, I would like you to open up the box and look inside. I say to Pat, I really don't know what it is that I'm doing because I'm a French major. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The fact that I've now revealed the contents by State Department's definition would be a disclosure of that ITAR item. Pat says to me, I get that you're a French major. Here's the manual. Now, I'm very smart. I say to Pat, Pat, is this a public manual that you pulled off the website? And all it's doing is telling me there's a dial on the left, a dial on the right. It's not telling me a whole lot. And it's all public. They published it. Pat says, no. I could give you that manual, but it wouldn't tell us what we need. Actually, this is the manual that the vendor sent in case we needed to go inside and repair and install, you know, and manipulate the technology, etc. That technical data is ITAR. I say to Pat, where can I find the manual? He says, well, it's actually just lying on the table. I'm thinking, really? And then I look at all the other foreign nationals in the laboratory, I'm thinking, gosh, have they seen the manual? Or in another scenario, Pat says, right, on my laptop, secured file, right? The problem, of course, is that I'm a foreign national. Pat would have to get me an export license, because it's ITAR, in order for me to access that technical data. Now we come full circle. Because the problem, of course, is that you see we have an anti-discrimination policy. We want to give everything to everybody. Now, if we're inventing something, right? I have 2 cans and a string. And I decide that with my 2 cans and a string, I could make a neutron bomb. I just put a little salt and a little bit of pepper, and I am going to publish my results. Morally, there may be a problem with that. And the university might not be happy at the fact that I'm publishing a new recipe for a neutron bomb. It's not a happy thing. But I can do it because I've invented it, and I'm publishing it. And I haven't accepted any proprietary data or tools from anybody else that carried export control provisions. On the other hand, I have my 2 cans and a string, and then in order to make it work, I now need source code. And that source code, I don't invent, I purchase or I receive in a collaboration, and it's ITAR, and I incorporate that. I can still publish what I'm doing with my invention, but I cannot include that which was proprietary. I can't include the source code or the, what would reveal, reveal about it. So now I want to come back to your question, because the answer is very nuanced. If I were inventing this from scratch, even though I could blow up the world, really, I could publish it. And sure, the implication is ITAR, but it's fundamental research. On the other hand, if I license software, and that software is controlled, and I'm incorporating it, A, I have to safeguard that controlled software if it's ITAR, and B, when I go to publish my incendiary results, it cannot include the way in which that code works. The fact that I have to safeguard that ITAR code on my laptop is a problem for us at UC. And we are only now in the process of reconciling that state's position about that to our own anti-discrimination policy. Because you can imagine we want to maintain that laboratory as open as possible. And I would say from a practical standpoint, in a sense, if one could avoid purchasing or receiving ITAR data and technology, that problem largely goes away. Because if what we have is a dual-use instrument or technology, so instead of your code being ITAR, your code is dual-use or not controlled at all, then I really don't have an access problem. The only exception to that would be advanced cryptography, very strong levels of cryptography. They do make a carve-out for foreign nationals, including students of 5 countries whom we control for anti-terrorism reasons: Iran, Cuba, Syria, North Korea, and Sudan. But even that, there is a way of working through that. So, here's what I need you to remember. If we have dual-use applications in our classroom, research laboratory, I've bought them, I've acquired them through collaboration. For the most part, I really, and I haven't accepted any restrictions on my results, there is not going to be a problem with foreign national access as to that dual-use equipment and technology in my laboratory. ITAR is a different story if I cross that line into disclosing what makes it ITAR. And in either case, when I go to send something out of the country, an instrument, equipment, materials, samples, prototypes, I have to determine whether or not it requires an export license. If it's a dual-use item, it'll be on a country-by-country, item-by-item, end-user basis. If it happened to be an ITAR item that was sending out, so now I have invented my neutron bomb, and I'm thinking, gosh, my colleague at the Sorbonne would really love to have this neutron bomb. I think I'm going to pop it in the mail, right? I will need an export license to get that neutron bomb to the Sorbonne. And if instead I decided I wanted it to go to the University of Beijing because I think they would find it interesting, There is no way the state would give me a license for that. So I have to know whether my item is dual use or ITAR. And if it's dual use, I have to classify it. I have to see if it's controlled for a particular country based on what it is and what it does. And if it's ITAR, I have to determine whether or not it would even be possible to get a license to send it out of the country. Well, let me pause there, because that's the basics. That's the single most important place we can be around export controls.
Who decides on that? When I research something, I calculate something, to whom I send to decide if it is dual use, export control, that I need to be very careful with it. Who decides?
Brian.
I don't decide. However, the OP has resources to help do it by jurisdiction or to help the
Right.
process that we would have to go through. I mean, and sometimes it's not a cut and dry, bright line test. Oftentimes it's taking all aspects, especially on something that's a prototype. It could involve a lot of...
Just about everything could be classified as dual use. Okay?
Well, there's actually a catch-all for most things that aren't specifically on the Commerce Control List.
So, great segue, if I may.
Please.
So, the Commerce Control List, for dual use purposes, is a big book. It is big. It's got, I don't know, hundreds, thousands, I don't know how many provisions. What they do is they divide the world into 10 categories. Nuclear materials, chemicals, microorganisms of interest to our health science, but chemicals, of course, to chemical engineering, materials processing, that would be measuring processing instrumentation, electronics, chips, computers, telecommunications, information security is cryptography, lasers and sensors, navigation and avionics, marine and propulsion systems. This is the way that the Commerce Department looks at things. And then when each of those categories, they create breakdowns into equipment, assemblies, and components. 0 through 9 could have equipment, assemblies, and components, test, inspection, and production equipment, materials, software, and technology. So by way of example, I could have software, to run a Category 2 spectrometer, or I might have software to run a supercomputer, etc. So an example of that I just pulled randomly would be 2B230, a pressure transducer. But look what they're doing. They're saying that in order for this item to be controlled under the Commerce List, it specifically has to be capable of measuring absolute pressures at any point in the range of 0 to 13 kPa, I have no idea what that is, and having both of the following characteristics, et cetera, et cetera. These definitions, to your point, are very specific. They are not controlling every pressure transducer or manometer. They are only controlling the ones that at a certain level have this defense capability. That's what they're doing. This one they control for nuclear proliferation. They feel that this could contribute to nuclear proliferation and anti-terrorism, and then they give you a list of all the countries that are controlled either for nuclear proliferation or anti-terrorism. I just picked 2, Singapore and China. They don't like those countries for this item. We go to a different example, graphite and ceramic materials. Again, a very detailed explanation. I didn't actually include it, but what I wanted to show you is this they don't like for missile technology and anti-terrorism reasons. And who's controlled for missile technology? Israel and Italy. You don't get two closer geopolitical allies, right? So we can't assume that just because they're a, quote, good country or a friend of Washington, that a control wouldn't apply. In this presentation, and it will be made available to everyone, I also include a definition of a defense article. And the key thing about what makes a defense article on the ITAR side is it does not have a predominant civil application, and it doesn't have a performance equivalent used for a civil application. Now, the State Department also regulates activity. And Pat and I spent many hours debating this provision. as recently as 10 minutes ago. And Pat always wins. It's true. He does. They are regulating, though this definition is now in flux with respect to research institutions. But the idea here is that if we train a military organization, you know, on a defense article, that's a defense service. And in theory, if, you know, I publish a software model, let's say it's a meteorological software model or atmospheric prediction model, right, and I put it out there for the world to see. Then I get a call from the Pakistani military, and they say, great weather model. Great. Now, tell me one more time how it works. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I've published it. Here's what my article says. And then they say, would this be great to run missions into Afghanistan? I'm like, click. Why? Because I am concerned about, even though that data, my model, it was published, and that it was totally, it wasn't even controlled, right? It was what we call EAR 99, or not controlled. If I am teaching them to use that for a defense purpose, and I know them to be a military organization, you know, arguably I fall within State Department's definition of a defense service. The Pakistani thing is a real example, because at the time when there was flooding last year in Pakistan, it was the military ultimately who stepped in to organize the rescue operations there in northern Pakistan. And I had a client who perfects atmospheric models, and indeed this happened. They got a call. And, of course, the question was, well, you know, are they using, because they would have used this for weather prediction, and they had to move people, you know, out of the way. And ultimately, we actually first ran it by state. We got a clearance to do it because I was concerned about who was calling on the phone. And in the end, state said, yes, this is essentially, it's the Pakistani military, but in that country, you know, they're in charge of a lot of things. And one of the things they're in charge of is, you know, advanced atmospheric conditions, and in this case, you know, getting people out of the way. So that's the thinking that goes into that.
If I can just jump in.
Yes.
So I think that the key point is that sometimes it's a process.
Yes.
There's no quick answer you can just necessarily see something right away. Sometimes there's a lot of questions that have to be asked of a faculty member just to better understand what it is we're talking about here. And sometimes it's not an easy answer, and sometimes there's debate as to where something goes, and you have to almost document why you conclude as you do.
But my specific question was teaching tool that we have been using for many years, 30 years, that is all over the world. So we are now restricted that I cannot teach it because I'm looking into my students, and they have rights because they're enrolled, they're UC Berkeley students. So one could use, the other one cannot. So how can I deal with this software application?
You had mentioned before that someone had applied and was denied. What did they apply for?
For this particular software package that I've been using for many years. It was now requires licensing process.
Okay, but when you say licensing, do you mean licensing by the software vendor?
No.
No, you mean licensing.
Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is, and you received it from Oak Ridge. Is that, you received it from Oak Ridge? Yeah. So Oak Ridge, because it is a national laboratory, could very well have a bank of controlled software. Could be controlled by EAR, could be controlled by ITAR, and Oak Ridge is saying to you, sure, you can have it, but recognize that you're going to have to get a deemed export license, you know, if it's controlled for your foreign national, which takes us again back to the heart of UC policy.
But I'm asking about that.
And the policy would be for you to decline at this point to receive anything from them that's controlled. What's odd to me is that they are only asking you now to control it when you said you've had it for a while.
It was my question. I said I have
Retroactively, they're restricting it,
Or maybe different versions?
or a new version.
Both questions. So my question is, your suggestion is I cannot use that software anymore in the classroom because it requires license.
Well, let me just pause for a second, because and this may be an offline, really an offline matter. It would be surprising to me that Oak Ridge would require a license now for something which you have already received. Oak Ridge would never put itself in the position of having licensed export-controlled software to you unless they were comfortable doing it. They're a DOE laboratory. No way. A new version, absolutely. A new version, absolutely. And so my guess is if the old versions did not require licensing, certainly they are viable teaching tools. To the extent that a new version would require a license, that's problematic because it is contrary to UC policy. And you would not, under that policy, be able to subscribe to that version.
If it is fundamental for teaching classes?
Even if it were essential for purposes of teaching your class, if it is controlled, UC policy is that you could not accept it. So we had a situation at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, our institution, where we had a funding opportunity from the Department of Energy that was a significant funding opportunity. It really came out of an initiative out of the White House, right? And in order for LB&L to participate, they would have had to have accepted, it was nuclear fuel optimization, they would have had to have accepted source code and information about it, about how certain nuclear reactors run. You know, the director at LB&L said, wait a minute, this is the White House. This is, a very important funding opportunity. And so we couldn't accept it. The results were going to be published. So it was fundamental research, right? It was the tool. So it then required LB&L to go to UCOP, the Office of the President, and potentially get a waiver of the policy. First of all, debatable whether the waiver would have been granted because the Regents and UCOP upholds the anti-discrimination policy really, very, very strongly. And secondly, at the end of the day, before it ever progressed, LB&L never got the funding opportunity. It became a moot point. But that's the analysis.
One moment and I will stop. So your suggestion is that I cannot use it as my teaching tool, meaning my U.S. students cannot be trained and prepared for job because I cannot use that particular software.
Here's the problem. The presumption here is that your student body might include both U.S. persons and non-U.S. persons. And the university does not want to be, even if as a factual matter they were all U.S. persons, so you would have no export control problem. Let's just say hypothetically they were only U.S. persons in the classroom or U.S. persons in the research laboratory. The university has the position that because that student group could potentially include foreign nationals, it does not want to even entertain the possibility of having to get a license.
In writing?
Sure.
I would assume
Yeah,
so.
And I guess what I would suggest is that, we should follow up on exactly what is being proposed
Yes.
by Oak Ridge. Because if they have given you versions of this software before, then those are publicly available.
I can send you
And-
an exchange of emails.
Yeah, and if those are not satisfactory for teaching your class now, you want to get the current version, then what I would suggest is that we follow up with Oak Ridge to find out what changed in this current version that they believe now requires to be controlled.
They just classified it as export control.
Well, right, and so the question is, was that a considered classification, or was that just an overly cautious,
And-
overly conservative? Because sometimes what will happen, we get this from manufacturers all the time, saying, hey, we'd be happy to have you look at some of our stuff. It's all export control. And we look at it and go, wait, it doesn't look export control to us. What is it? And then sometimes they'll lift some of those
time. But
Well-
you see policy, I cannot use it anymore.
Well,
Well, no, once it's lifted, then,
It cannot be lifted.
once it's lifted, then it can be used. If, now let's go on to the next section. If it can't be lifted, if they say, no, the whole thing has been updated, and it's all restricted, then that's true. Under UC policy, we can't use that in a class because, you know, our classrooms, our libraries, our laboratories are open to all without regard to ethnicity, citizenship,
I
visa
want,
status.
I want
et
it in writing.
cetera. Yeah, well, it's available.
so I do want to kind of amplify this a little bit because we see lots of contracts where at LB&L, particularly on software licenses, where you do see this language, export controlled. We call, you know, it's usually an industrial sponsor. We call them a provider, and it's really that they're sloppy. What they're really saying is diversion, contrary to U.S. law, prohibited. What they should have said is you can't send it out of the country without a license, and that's true. It may be controlled for certain destinations, or it might only be controlled for Iran, Cuba, Syria, North Korea, and Sudan. Nobody's disputing that, right? But instead of being precise, because they want to default to the most convenient, compliant position, they simply slap on a label that says export controlled. And it's very misleading. So I think in this situation, it would be very worthwhile to find out what it is that they're saying so you're not prohibited. I want to point out two things around publication restrictions because these are practical considerations. A request by a sponsor to review research results to make sure that we are not including any proprietary information in our our publication or in our draft is permissible, assuming it's really for that purpose and it's for a limited amount of time. So as a sponsor, I can't say to you, gosh, I would like the right to review this proprietary information for like the next 10 years. That's going to be a publication restriction. But if it's for a reasonable period of time, you know, proportionate to the work and the people involved, that's okay. And also, you do have a blackout period for patent applications. That's okay. That's not a publication restriction. That's just a function of the patent process. So those are two things to take into account about that. So again, you know, sponsored research is very carefully trying to screen out restrictive clauses. NDAs. Brian and I worked on a matter this morning where if you are asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement, it really depends what the NDA is for. If the NDA is for the purpose of just receiving background information that your student or research body doesn't, you know, need to do the research and you're a U.S. person, that's okay because it's segregatable. You know, I'm IBM. I want to give you something by way of background information that you need to do your fundamental research. I'm not saying don't restrict the results. I'm not controlling who's going to work on it. I'm just saying here's an equation, and I want to give it to you because you need it to formulate what will be your fundamental research. I can sign an NDA. Now, IBM is going to make sure that before they do that, I'm a U.S. person if it's export controlled, because IBM doesn't want to be in the position of actually disclosing that to a foreign national. So certain NDAs that are narrowly accepted are okay, but I actually think when we encounter those situations, those really should go to these guys to look at. And lastly, software and encryption, they have their own rules about how to publish software and what makes cryptography controlled. This is a detailed explanation. I wanted you to have it. So when you download the materials, I would suggest taking a look at this because it just provides some definitional background to what it means to publish software, if that's what you do, and what levels of encryption may be controlled. When do I need a license? Again, we talked about anytime we send something out of the country, we have to determine whether or not it would require a license. And I want to go back to this. Very often we get the question, can I take something with me when I'm conducting research abroad? And the answer is maybe yes, maybe no. You know, the Commerce Department, those dual-use regulations, they have a tool of trade exception. And they say, look, if you have something that might otherwise require a license. So we had one the other day in my office, happened to be a company, but it's the same idea. They were sending, one of the guys wanted to take something to Argentina. and it would have required a license to get it to Argentina. But really, it was something that he could keep on his person and control at all times. For the limited purpose of his being there, he's not passing it on to anybody. He actually could take it with him as a tool of trade. Then, very interestingly, he said to me, you know, and I have this other piece of equipment that I want to send down there that I'm using in connection with this. Can I apply the tool of trade to that? I said, no, because there's just no way that you're going to meet that personal protection safeguard rule that this has on that piece of equipment that you want to send down there. There are just too many people who need to access it. It's going to be moving around. There's, you know, commerce wouldn't sanction it. So we do have this tool of trade of exception. If we had an ITAR item that we needed to do in the safe, he told me, look, and it happens to be a piece of military electronic, and I can put it in my pocket. No, because there is no tool of trade exception for ITAR instruments. Again, research results we can send, right? We can send anywhere we want to send them. No one is, research results are free to take with you, free to send, basically. Lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about OFAC. That stands for the Office of Foreign Assets Controls. This is the Treasury Department. And Treasury runs our economic sanctions program. We have 31 countries, approximately, with who we don't like and with whom we have problems of one sort or another. And of those 31 countries, there are 5 that we really disdain. The 5 that we disdain are, of course, Cuba, Iran, Syria, North Korea, and Sudan. And so those are the countries that OFAC regulates or are the most restricted. But they're not just restricting imports and exports. They're restricting all transactions with those countries, of which import-export is just one type of transaction, right? So, for example, I can't, fund an operation in Iran. I'm not importing or exporting or anything, but I can't send money to Iran. I can't even do research in Iran unless I obtain a license from OFAC. So UCSF Medical Center, for example, got an NIH grant to perform HIV-related epidemiological research, and one of the PIs at the medical center had a relationship with one of the large medical centers in Tehran. It made sense because he would have had access to that population. We had to get a license first from OFAC, and we did. But we got the license because really the research was epidemiological in nature. We weren't, bringing over any sophisticated equipment there. And to get that license, they said, are you going to bring any laptops, any GPS devices? Yeah, we were going to bring our laptops, of course, because we were going to, be using them. Again, OFAC didn't have any problem with the license. We got another inquiry recently out of Irvine. We had a PI who wanted to actually facilitate the setting up of a technology laboratory. He had a relationship with a technology laboratory in Tehran, wanted to set up, actually set it up there, bring things from here to there, buy things there. We could have gone to Treasury for a license. I truly don't think we would have gotten it. It brought them too close to this idea of benefiting the economy of that country. Cuba just liberalized, Washington just liberalized the Cuba regulations, and we have always had a long-standing research relationship with Cuba, notwithstanding all of the rhetoric out of Washington. It's very well codified, and in many cases it is possible to get a license to do things in Cuba, and in some cases we don't even need a license. Because it comes up so frequently, and the University of Havana, of course, is very interested in having our researchers participate in their programs, we have a Cuba desk here at UCOP, and I'm going to refer to it on the back slide if that ever comes up. I've included a lot of detail around OFAC. You can read it as you go along. But again, collaborative research, for example, with Iran, in itself is likely not going to be a restricted service. We're doing fundamental research. We could have an intellectual exchange with a PI at the University of Tehran. But then he says, look, in order to give this the gravity that it needs, I need an oscilloscope. Well, we're going to need a license to send that over. Or he says, look, you've got the oscilloscope, I've got the samples, I'm going to send you to Berkeley the samples, I want you to analyze them, right, and then send me back the results. The problem is we can't import the samples. Right. So collaborative research with Iran only to an extent. With Cuba, more likely possible. Sudan, very tricky because Sudan is in transition now. We've essentially got two countries. And so most of the activities at a humanitarian plane for that, anything else likely wouldn't get licensed. But again, this is all based on a license need. I want to refer us to, on the Cuba desk is Padona Young, and Eleanor Reedy in our counsel's office is also handling some of the Cuba work, but Padona Young would be a good starting place. And for contact purposes, this is Brian, do we have your phone number correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, great. And Pat, who's based here on campus. And I promised our sponsors that I would keep this to exactly 1 hour. So with that, I will close. Open it up to any questions that you may have. Yes?
I have a question about the distinction between defense and military application. So I work in a water center, and we're doing some innovative work on wastewater to drinking water technology. Lots of applications. Everyone says, oh, could be used on the military base, could be used elsewhere. But we're thinking that those would be tested in anyway. There's primarily civilian use. If we were to have a particular award from the Department of Defense for applying those technologies in a jet fighter or something, then they would kick in.
Well, that's because most likely the award would come with a restriction. Say DITRA, you know, would say, look, you know, because of this specific application, your results are going to be restricted, and under UC policy, it wouldn't happen. And, you know, the sad part, of course, is it might be $25 million, but it just wouldn't happen. Yes?
I have a question on the personnel side.
Yes.
So often we get requests to recruit and stipulate citizenship requirements. So based on what you said, it doesn't sound like we should be able to do that.
Well, okay. So in general, to inquire about citizenship in general, to uphold a federal export control regulation is okay. It does not run afoul of state or federal anti-discrimination regulations, because if we're holding a federal patent, but it may very well run afoul of UC policy. So we have to think about it in those two contexts.
In fact, what we have done, there's a guidance document from OP about when they ask for citizenship information on a research team. And of course, the question is, you know, why do they need it? Because they may be engaging in de facto discrimination. A lot of times they'll say, no, we just need to make sure that everyone's complying with the immigration laws. In which case we say, okay, well, we're concerned about that too, so we'll check, and then we'll issue a certification to you that everyone does comply. And we've actually used that strategy successfully with the Department of Defense. So if you have a sponsor who is asking for citizenship information, let me know.
No, not asking for it. They're stipulating U.S. citizenship as a requirement of
Right.
being hired.
Well, so those are the kinds of things that we have talked about before. UC can't accept awards that are limited only to UC citizenships, if it's for UC citizenship, if it's for a research project.
But they can issue a waiver if it's for training the workforce, though.
Right. So there's the workforce development exception.
Correct.
And so then that's right. And we have young investigator awards under that workforce development. So for example, we've had awards from the CIA where they say a young investigator has to be, you know, gotten a PhD within the past 5 years. They can have a foreign national mentor. They can have foreign nationals work on the research team, but the investigator has to be a U.S. citizen. That's okay, because of course all the research is going to be open. It's all going to be available to foreign nationals, and it's a part of that workforce development. The problem is when they say, okay, here's the research project, very sensitive research project. Every last person on the team has to be a U.S. citizen. Well, that's the one that violates the citizenship and discrimination laws.
One thing I wanted to footnote is that in February, coming back to this idea that the government has increased its enforcement of export control in February, as of February 22nd, I think it is, H-1 visa petitions for H-1 visa candidates, the petitions, applications, have to certify whether the H-1 candidate will have access to export control technology, and if so, whether the applicant is positioned to protect that technology until such time as a license is obtained. And so I see a couple of things about that. I see commerce, but mainly I see defense and state reaching over the fence on Pennsylvania Avenue to the Immigration Service and say, we're going to use you for our own export control purposes, and we're going to insert now export control in really a requirement that was there all along. All it's doing, though, is elevating it now to where, we all have to look at the H-1 candidates.
I've never had that before, and we process a lot of H-1.
Yes.
We just got a questionnaire, and we didn't even know what that was, how to answer the question.
Yes. So actually, right, so all the campuses have now, because it's a relatively new requirement, and then I'm in the process of trying to write a guidance, that will explain the background and explain a little bit better how to field the questionnaire.
So for the moment, the Berkeley International Office has the checklist, and it basically asks the requester of a visa, can you tell us that the person's not using any of this kind of control technology?
Right.
If they can say yes comfortably, then no problem, go ahead, process the visa. If they think, oh, wait a minute, we do have some control technology that we want to, have this person use, and it's proprietary information and it's export control, then they get referred to me, and then we look through, okay, how is the, person going to be using this? Can we structure the work so the person doesn't have access to it? Or is it something where, in order to do their work, they may need a license? If they're a researcher, of course, the question would be, well, wait a minute, how are you going to be doing fundamental research? But we sometimes get these requests, let's say, for the Space Sciences Lab, for engineers that aren't doing any research, they're just doing their fabrication and production.
I really appreciate your question. Was very helpful, so thank you for that, and I would really encourage that connection, to sort it out.
Because it does, I had both last and this semester several students that didn't get the license, so it's very tricky how to then feed or teach in class.
Sure. Thank you. Any other questions? Great. Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.